are back. Welcome back to Dismantling the High Performance Narrative. I'm Rob Kalwarowsky, and we have our high performance coach, Lauren Williams. Lauren, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm good. And today, like last week, we took a real deep dive into your story and your struggles. And so today we're turning the light on me. So I guess I should turn it over to you. Like, where are we starting?
Yeah. Oh, how the tables have turned, huh? No, yeah, I mean you've told me your story before, but I think I've only heard bits and pieces of it. So I'm just as interested as everybody else to hear your story. But yeah, if you want to just kind of walk us through, where everything started for you and really like when someone asks you what's your story when it comes to your journey, how do you frame that?
I always talk about my story and I talk about it in different ways depending on different audiences, right? But I think with this one, like we're talking mainly about mental health and about performance. And so where I'd like to tell the story today is like obviously born, raised Ottawa, Ontario. When I was 9 years old, I started playing water polo and it was like, this is it for me. This is the greatest thing that I've ever done. And like I'm not a like if you meet me in person, I'm not a good athlete necessarily. Like I can't run and I'm not very like athletic,
Uh-huh.
but in the pool it was different. And I got real serious about it real quick. When I was like 12, we won, I think 12 or 13, we started winning provincial titles and we basically won them almost every year.
Mhm.
Um, I was training somewhere in the 15 to 25 hours per week, depending on like when between basically 13 to 18. Like when you said last week, like you were on the ice 3 hours a day, like I was doing that. I was training nine times a week pretty much, like
Mhm.
doubles on the weekend and then full time. Um, yeah, and I played on the U16 national team. I won a national title when I was 15. Um, I played on the U18 national team. And then when I was in grade 11, I started looking at kind of this decision point in my life, whether it was I had a few coaches that had played in the Olympics and like played for the men's senior national team. And I was like, I could either go there, move to Calgary, centralize and start going for that, or I could, go to college.
Yeah.
And that year I was like 2005, 2006. We hadn't really made the Olympics since the 80s. And so
Mhm.
I was like, maybe the Olympics is not possible for me. So what's possible is the NCAA.
Yeah.
So I started, I went out, I started sending emails to coaches in the NCAA and I got recruited to a few schools, but the one that intrigued me the most was MIT, obviously, like world class institution, one of the top engineering programs in the world.
Yeah.
And
Arguably the world-class institution.
for engineering, yeah, it's basically that. And that was the one that like even though they were D3, it didn't really matter in terms of polo because you play everybody. There's only like I think there's 20 teams on the East Coast. And
Right.
so you play everybody. So I was fortunate enough to get in. I think like obviously athletics helped. I was always a good student as well,
Mhm.
but definitely, I was 2% international acceptance rate. So you need a little luck on your side to get in.
Yeah.
And I was dropped on campus and I kind of had the inverse experience to you. Like I was dropped on campus. I was one of the top players on the team almost immediately. The first I started immediately. They
Mhm.
even put me starting center, where in high school I wasn't like I would only set, uh, as kind of like if I had a good matchup or an isolation type of thing. And yeah, it was going well. Like polo, I mean, we were losing games, but I was playing well. And yeah, and then first round of midterms came, and I found out I was a C student.
Yeah.
And like my whole academic career up to that point was very much like I could study the night before, I could walk into the exam and I would get 90, 95, whatever. And the inverse of that. And it got real, like it didn't really get dark in a sense of like suicidal, but we talked about these strategies that we use and these strategies that are unsustainable. And for me, what really fueled me through that period was
Mhm.
shame.
Okay.
And what it was I was, I mean, one big thing for me was like, if I drop out, like if I fail and I flunk out, I'm going to have to go back to Ottawa and they're going to laugh at me because they're going to say, hey, you didn't belong to go there.
Yeah.
And even I had this girl in high school and she applied. We were all, there was like 5 or 6 of us that applied to US colleges. And we had a group because like the norm was to just apply in Ontario.
Yeah.
And she applied to all the Ivies and got rejected at all of them. And I got into MIT. I only applied to MIT and I got in.
Yeah.
Plus like U of T and Waterloo and stuff. But she when I got in, she came up to me and she said like, you don't belong. You didn't deserve it. And like technically she's a better student than me. She didn't have the athletics, like she was whatever, but that's what she said to me. And it really, like, she became the fuel that was like, this is the person that's going to laugh at me if I drop out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not
And
that I
I just want
even,
to say
yeah, go ahead.
something too about that is like, I really identify with that little piece of the narrative as well, in terms of the shame of not succeeding. Like, you can talk your way out of anything just by saying, if I don't get through this, if I don't succeed at this, what are other people going to think of me? And I think that's something that a lot of high performers get into, and I got into myself, of like the one kid from my school that went, D1 in athletics, and if I can't hack it here, then I'm a total fraud, and everybody can say, yeah, welcome back, happy to have you back where you should be.
It's funny, right? Like, I wasn't even close to this girl, right? Like,
Mhm.
we don't talk. I haven't, like, basically never talked to her since. But yet it's like, it's exactly that, right? It's like, I think I'm the only person from my high school to ever have gone to MIT.
Mhm.
And it's like, oh, you don't belong because you weren't the best student, you weren't whatever. And it's like, well, now I hacked it. So there you go. You can take it and shove it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, yeah, I mean, we continue, like I doubled down on a lot of those strategies we talked about, like the shame fueled me, and then just working harder fueled me.
Yeah.
That was what we talked about last time. And, like it turned around for me. I got a handle for it. I learned how to study. I learned how to work. My junior year during polo season, I finished the semester with straight A's. That was like the pinnacle of my academic career. I
Mhm.
felt like, hey, I've made it. I've proven that I can hack it. And yeah, and then on my 22nd birthday, I graduated from MIT with a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering and a minor in management.
Mhm.
I was unemployed for about 6 months, and then I got a job as an economist. This whole time, my dad was telling me, like, hey, if you don't get a job in engineering, you've wasted your degree. Like, you've wasted all that money that you spent to go to MIT. And so I was looking for engineering jobs. And one night I took a friend of mine to a hockey game, and she introduced me to one of her friends who worked in mining.
Mhm.
And the woman who worked in mining said, like, hey, we always hire engineers. Send me your resume. And 5 months later, I was an engineer. I was a reliability engineer. I didn't know what reliability engineering was. We
Mhm.
never learned that in college. It wasn't a degree that you could take. And yeah, I was dropped into mining. I didn't really know much about the equipment. I didn't know much about mining, but I knew a lot about the things I know.
Yeah.
And the story plays out very similarly. Like, I spent a year in mining. I saved them $33 million on like very new and innovative projects for them.
Mhm.
And I walked into my annual review and I thought, hey, I'm going to get promoted. Hey, I'm going to get like a big raise. I'm going to get, recognition for this. And I did. I got the opposite. They gave me the minimum raise they could give me. and the fixed mindsets that were at play in that company, the fear-based leadership that was at play, really started to take hold. Like they pushed back on all these new ideas. And they basically, one time, one of the vice presidents sent an email and it said, like, if any engineer comes to you with a new idea, with a new project, that just tell them, how have we always done it this way, and make them do it that way.
Yeah.
And that was my experience. And for me, like, you're coming from this career of athletics where it's all about getting better every day. You're coming from this career in academics where at MIT, like, if you don't literally study from day one to the last day, you ain't going to make it.
Right.
And, and it really took me into a dark place. Right. And like, you're used to getting recognized for putting stats on the stat sheet. You're used to getting like recognition in these ways. And they basically said, like, everything you've ever learned in your entire life, like, take that, throw it out. It's not worth it here.
Yeah. Everything that's made you succeed in life before, just get rid of it, because that's not how we work here.
And that was where, we talked last time about feeling alone.
Mm-hmm.
That was really where that took hold. Like, I felt like, I've succeeded at these really high levels. Nobody around me in this environment has ever reached levels like I have.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not understanding my perspective of the world. They're not understanding like what's possible.
Right.
And I was also living in a small town. I didn't really know that many people. And I listened to Joe Rogan, and they said, like, exercise and nature will help depression. Because I knew something wasn't right, but I didn't know what it was.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started running. I had access to some of the most beautiful mountain bike trails in the world, and a huge network of them. And so I started running. From someone who doesn't run at all, I started running 2 to 4 hours a day through the mountains by myself.
Mm-hmm.
And that worked for about, I don't know, 6 to 9 months, I would say. And it got real dark for me. Like, I have this extreme personality, and it went to suicide really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have the depression where you just feel sad. I don't have the depression where you just sit on your couch. Like, none of that is mine. I got extreme with it, and it went like, go start training hard and drink a lot and think about suicide a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And that was where it went. And then it took me about 9 months, and I had a friend of mine who was a social worker, and I reached out to her. It was like, what should I do to actually feel better?
Yeah.
And it took a little time. Like, I talk about the courage in asking for help a lot. And I do believe it takes courage. It took me 9 months. And then I walked into the hospital. It was a Saturday morning. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. There was only 4 people there because, we were in a remote area. And I told the doctor I needed help. I said I was depressed. I needed help.
Mm-hmm.
And she printed a survey off the internet, and she had me fill it out, and she diagnosed me with major depressive disorder.
Mm-hmm.
And she did one of the things that I still feel is very irresponsible. She wrote me a prescription for an SSRI. She sent me home, and she said, hey, if it gets worse, come back.
Yeah.
And that started probably, I would say, the worst 2 weeks of my life.
Mm-hmm.
I went from sleeping about 6 to 8 hours a night, being able to get off the couch, go running, go to the gym, go to the pool, to basically not being able to get off the couch much at all. I started sleeping about 2 to 4 hours a night, and it made everything worse. The medication made everything worse for me. Not only did it make the sleep not happen, it made my depression worse. It made the suicidal ideation worse. And it took me into a real dark place. And that whole thing about monitor your own mood, like, I was living alone. We would get Fridays off every second week. And literally I could go from Thursday afternoon to Monday morning without having a meaningful conversation with another human being.
Yeah.
And so you're going alone, you're lying on your couch, like, and it just got real bad. 2 weeks later, I had a falling out with a friend of mine who just was like, hey, you can't keep talking about your depression and suicide with me. Like, I can't handle it. And so she was like, I can't do this. Like, we can't talk anymore. And I called my parents, and they were like, hey, you got to go back to your hospital and like get them to write you a prescription for short-term disability and
Mm-hmm.
come home. And my dad said something to me that was probably the most profound thing he's ever said. He said, no job is worth your life. And
Yeah.
so I went back to the hospital. I got a new prescription for different SSRIs, and I flew home that night. And and then 2 weeks later, I returned back. They booked me with a psychiatrist. We started playing with medications. They put me in group therapy, and I told that story about being in group therapy for 45 minutes and just having no resonance at all with anybody else in there.
Right. Which can
And
be extremely isolating in itself.
And that was the thing, right? That group therapy session, the other three people couldn't get out of bed. I remember leaving that group therapy session after 45 minutes, going for a 10-kilometer run in -10 weather, and then going to my therapy session with my psychiatrist the next week, and him telling me I wasn't depressed enough.
Oh.
And that's what I say was really the end for me. Like, at that point, it was about 2013. I had tried 5 or 6 different medications. I had gone to a life coach. I had gone to church. I had gone to group therapy. I did 10 sessions with a psychiatrist. And basically, nobody understood who I was. Nobody understood what I was going through. I didn't fit in any of those boxes that we talked about last week.
Mm-hmm.
And I gave up. I gave up. I pulled back. I stopped trying. I stopped asking for help. And I just said, like, hey, like, suicide's inevitable for me. And it's only a matter of time before I take my own life.
Mm-hmm.
And so 2014 I moved, or 2013 I moved. I started a company. It failed. I got a new job as a reliability consultant. I did that for 5 years. I started Rob's Reliability Project, one of the leading maintenance and reliability podcasts in the world right now, which I don't host anymore, but I used that podcast to meet your boss, Susan.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to Susan about 13 months ago. And I said to her, I said, hey, I need help turning this podcast and my brand as a leading maintenance and reliability leader to start a business, because I don't like my job. I've never liked any of the jobs I've worked in. And I see all this, like, every place, I didn't know it at the time, but every place I had worked for had bad leadership. They
Mm-hmm.
suffered from fixed mindsets. It was all very similar across not only the places I've worked, but also every site I had ever consulted at.
Yeah.
And the work I started doing with Susan, she was the first person that when I talked to her about my depression, she understood who I was. She understood that, like, you put on this face, you can still perform at a high level. You can still, like, you don't check any of these boxes, and you're different. And I jokingly say, like, Susan is a psycho like I am, and you're a psycho like I am too,
Yeah.
Lauren. And like, there was resonance there that I didn't have basically since I left college.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's the same thing. Like Lauren, the reason we started this podcast was I told a story about my suicide attempt, or I don't necessarily call it an attempt, but basically it was a time that I almost took my own life.
Mm-hmm.
And you, after that, told your story about depression, and I never felt more understood by somebody in my entire life. And that's what I felt with not only with Susan, but also with you, is we're not alone. And even this last year, like, we've opened up emotions, and it's gotten real dark for me. Even this weekend, like this last weekend was real dark for me. But I kept going to these doctors. And even this year, like I've tried, I think 5 or 6 new medications this year. Again,
Mhm.
none of them have worked for me. It's felt very much like a trial and error process that doctors don't really understand, that the error takes you really into a bad place. And that's why I wanted to start this show. Like, I think for my story, it's like I've tried 10 to 15 different medications. None of them have worked. I
Mm.
tried therapy. I tried, all this stuff. And it's like, to me, it's very much about finding the person that can help you. And that person likely is not going to be the first person. And that just the medication probably is not going to be the first one, but there
Right.
is a path out. And it's just about trying until you find it.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that like along with your story and how absolutely incredible it is in terms of, how much you've had to persevere through the trial and error process and how many different avenues you've gone down to try and get, a handle on what it is that you're feeling and make yourself feel better. I think that there are some like two things that I really want to focus on in terms of like the high performance narrative and how it has played out in your life. And the first one is this idea that as high performers, we double down on all of the strategies that we've used our entire lives, whether it's in sport and business and school. When we start to notice that we feel these things, we're like, well, all right, let's kick into ultra control mode. I can fix this by doing all of these other things. I can fix this by, hitting the gym more. I can fix this by studying until midnight or whatever it might be. We throw ourselves into these things almost so that we can distract ourselves from what's really going on and start to convince people that we're okay, we're fine. But it's interesting for me because those strategies that you used, even in school at MIT, abruptly did not work for you at work because you went from like, oh, hey, I get all of these external validators of my work and my success at school as an athlete and as a student. But then when you did it at work, you were met with none of that. And I think it could be interesting just to spend some time talking a little bit about that and what it felt like for you to double down on those strategies that you relied on for your whole life and have them suddenly not work.
Yeah, and that's where I'm going with the leadership aspect of the
Mm-hmm.
work I do now. I believe that leadership is very broken in heavy industry. I'm sure it is everywhere, but I just have experience in heavy industry.
Mm-hmm.
And I see that as, I always liken it to like you're trying to swim against a cruise ship. The cruise ship is going and you're trying to move it, and like you don't have a chance.
Yeah.
And that's where, and you saw that how it played out for me, right? And I've even had this thought when I was in the midst of doing it, was like I turned into exercise. Like I was training 2 out of 4 hours a day. I didn't have anything to train for. Like it wasn't like I was competing. I wasn't in any races. Like I did one Tough Mudder when it came to town.
Mm-hmm.
But like it wasn't like I was had anything to do. And yet, like I even had this thought, I was like, this is all I know. And the drinking got real bad because it was like I knew that too. Like in college, we partied. This was more destructive because I was drinking alone for a lot of the time.
Yeah.
But it was like that's what I knew as well. And
Mm-hmm.
so it turned inwards on me. And then we talked last time about my diet too. Is like I started eating basically one salad a day, and I was training 2 to 4 hours a day. And I was like, I got like really lean, and I was getting compliments from a lot of people like, hey, you look great. Like everything's going well. And,
And
and
you're
it's
sitting
like,
there going like, you have no idea what's going on to make this happen.
yeah, you're like, I look the best I've ever looked. And yet I spend all my waking hours thinking about suicide. And I think like that's the piece that people don't see. And that's
Mm-hmm.
what the show is about, right? It's like people don't see they see the external.
Yeah.
Oh, you're going to the gym. Oh, you're working this job. Like I was making like 100 grand a year. Like
Mhm.
it must be, you saved them. Like I worked there 2.5 years. I saved them like 60 something $1 million.
Right.
And they're like, that's what they see. And yet it was probably the worst 2 years of my life.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, talk a little bit more too in terms of like how often do you think it happens for high performers to have that status in their life where things look so great on the outside when on the inside it's the exact opposite? And maybe also talk a little bit about like what it feels like to be in that position. Like where you're like, well, I'm not going to tell people that things aren't great because they look great and that's what I want.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of had two perspectives on this one, right? I
Mhm.
think on some aspect, I did feel like I, like I looked good physically. And so that was a thing. I did also have a perspective that as an MIT graduate that I was a failure. Like I needed to get a high performance, like a job in finance. I tried to, or
Mhm.
get a job in consulting, for like a McKinsey or a Bain or a BCG or something like that. And so like I did feel in some aspects that I let myself down in a sense that I didn't get the job that I thought I should get or that I was supposed to get.
Mhm.
Um, and that was also kind of a battle for me. And it still kind of is as well. It's just like you feel like you should be doing more. Like I had a couple of friends raise $90 million a few weeks ago, and you're
Mhm.
like, it's incredible, right? And but then you're like, well, what am I doing?
Right.
Right. And I
Mhm.
do like, I mean, we're doing this cool podcast and like literally we're going to save lives with this and it's going to mean more than anything.
Mhm.
And it's like, it's very hard to destroy that narrative where you're like,
So you're
should I be
comparing.
making millions of dollars or should I be trying to
Yeah.
help people? Like,
Mhm. No, absolutely. And I think that what you touched on briefly there too is, as high performers, we're always taught like you have a plan. We call them goals. Like we know where we want to be 5 years from now. And in the world of athletics, which you and I are both very familiar with, there's very concrete steps. You master certain skills, you move up in different age groups, levels, what have you, and then you're there. And there's different ways that you can adjust if you're not where you want to be. But we try to do that in life and say, like, oh, well, I'm going to graduate, I'm going to get a job, and then I'm going to get promoted, and then it's going to be great. And I'm going to use all of these skills that I've learned from sport, and people are going to love it. But the reality is that like that kind of planning doesn't work all the time. And when that planning doesn't work for high performers in particular, I think that's when you really start to see some of those issues pop up with mental health.
yeah. And that's been my experience too. Right. I
Mhm.
think like I would say, like honestly, I would say I've been adrift since college. Like I haven't really had goals. I haven't really had a direction.
Mhm.
And like Susan was the first person to unlock any sort of meaning in me. And that's like part of the reason for this show.
Mhm.
But I've found that that's been one of the hardest things is like, what do I look at as a measure of success for myself? What do I look at as a measure of progression or growth or whatever? Like, am I just supposed to look at like the numbers in my bank account? Am I
Right.
supposed to look at the status of the job that I have? Like, what am I supposed to look at?
What does success even mean anymore is also the big question. Because there's no championships for life.
There should be.
There should be. That's what.
But that's the hardest part, right? And I think like I still struggle with that aspect. And it's something like even in this new therapy that I'm doing, it's very much about like you think that therapy should make it better immediately, or you should see some sort of growth, like it's working.
Yeah.
And like what I've been struggling, especially even this last month, is like I went to therapy and it feels like my mental health got worse.
Yeah.
And so it's like, I think that's something also, is like people need to understand that you're opening up
Mhm.
your emotions, you're opening up how you feel. And if you've buried trauma, which I clearly have, not only with the suicide attempt, but probably with some other stuff,
Yeah.
it's that it's going to have to get worse before it gets better. And the hardest part, and I think like this is something that, you know, Susan has talked to me a lot about. It's like she keeps saying like it's like a hard workout, and you have to get through it before you can, see the success. And the hardest part, I think, for mental health in that is when it gets so dark that you can't see the light out, like
Yeah.
or also like you don't have a picture of what's the other side going to look like. I just feel like it's a very hard thing for us to see. And for me, like the lights still turn out for me. And the hardest part is, how do you get it back?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, also what you're touching on is this idea of having a purpose in life and having that set idea of what you're here to do, which, when you're in college, your job is to be a good student. When you're an athlete, your job is to succeed in whatever sport you're doing. But and I think you're starting to find it too, especially with like now we're doing this. So why the high performance narrative? Why start this now? What is this journey kind of bringing you to?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's turned into meaning, right? And I think what I've found is the struggles that I've had, both in finding help that has worked, and being related to by the people that are supposed to help me, um, and the leadership aspects that I see in industry, like the poor leadership contributed to that fall,
Mhm.
and the the poor medical help that I got sort of led to the years of suffering, like the turning off from asking for help. Even, the suicide attempt in the first place was because of the medication. And I think for me, like the reason for this show and the reason for the leadership aspect is I think and I believe really strongly that the suffering that I went through, other people are going through it the same as I have.
Mhm.
And even by me sharing my story, I can help them. And by doing the leadership stuff that I'm doing, we can hopefully alleviate, we can do preventative maintenance on some of the aspects that before they happen, right? Like I think if I would have been dropped into a culture that was growth mindset, and they're recognizing people for being people, and they're really built on connection, and they're very much innovative, and the feedback loops are very tight, I think like maybe I wouldn't have had to go through this.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
yeah, and for me, like that's one of the reasons for the leadership side, for the mental health side, like for this show, it's that resonance, right? I think there's a lot of people like you and I that have gone through some of this stuff, that also asked for help and also got help that didn't really understand them. And
Mhm.
that is what this show is about. It's about community for those people.
Yes, yes. I love that word. I love the idea of community. Because, as you said, like, yes, I experienced so many of these things and so many of those same feelings that you had where you're like, where do I fit into this? I'm not what these other people are describing as depression. I don't experience these things, but I'm definitely feeling it. And I need somebody to understand that. And I think that cultivating, this show and this community can mean so much in terms of just letting people know that their experience is not, you know, one that has to be a lone road. Like there are people who are feeling these exact same things as you, and that are willing to share their story and hear yours as well.
Yeah. I mean, that's the biggest thing, right? For this show, I think is we, we feel alone,
Mm-hmm.
and like the depression, the suicidal ideation, it makes you full, like come back on yourself, and you withdraw from social activity, you withdraw from all these things. And when you ask for help and the help is not like, it doesn't work, whether that's the medication side, whether that's you go to like I did, you go to group therapy and they don't understand you, or you
Mm-hmm.
go to a psychiatrist and he tells you you're not depressed enough, it makes you feel more isolated than you truly are.
Mm-hmm.
And if you feel isolated, you feel like no one understands you, you feel like you're helpless, you feel like you're powerless, you feel all those things.
That
Like
walks
it
you down.
only ends one way, right?
Yeah, it walks you down a dark road really fast. That's for sure. And I think the idea too is this is the space to hear and be heard. Like, just by listening to some of these stories, someone is going to connect with it and say, like, this is me. This makes total sense. And like, we come from very different realms of life and very different sports and different backgrounds, but there is so much of your story that I identify with, and there's a lot in my story that you identify with. And I think that that in itself is so strong, and what is going to carry this through, and what is going to be so helpful to so many people out there.
Yeah, and for me, Lauren, like I started sharing my story on my podcast in December last year,
Mm-hmm.
and I got literally hundreds of messages from all around the world from people who they suffer as well. They had
Yeah.
a family member, a friend, a parent, or whatever who committed suicide, and it was the most meaningful thing I've ever done.
Yeah.
And it built connection in ways that I didn't even know was possible. And that's where even like what we're doing tomorrow with the podcast with Fix and the fundraiser for 100,000 that we're
Mm-hmm.
going to be promoting, that is meaningful stuff. We can literally save people's lives. And like I can sit here and say I've saved companies hundreds of millions of dollars, and nothing means more than getting a message like I got that said, like, I've suffered from depression my entire life, and your
Mm-hmm.
podcast really helped me. I
Yeah.
got that message, and it was the most meaningful thing I've ever gotten.
Mm-hmm. So in an essence, just kind of sum up, what has really helped you start to turn things around.
Yeah, and that's the message I want. Like, basically, I want two things for people to take away from this. The first thing is you're not alone, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I know you're going to resonate with my story. I know you're going to resonate with Lauren's story, and I know you're going to resonate with the people that we're going to have on coming up. And the second thing is just don't stop trying and find somebody who resonates with you. Like if I hadn't found Susan, we wouldn't be here. It wouldn't have opened me up. I wouldn't be talking about it. And I think like she's put me on a path where now, I've met a trauma specialist, like a
Mm-hmm.
psychologist who specializes in trauma. And I've taken some steps in that way that I think are going to really help me. And I've already started to, maybe the mood hasn't come yet, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm seeing the progress on that side, and I'm hopeful that it's going to be able to pull me through. And so those are really the big things for me is like, this is about community. This podcast is about community. And if you want to share your story with us, you can email us highperformancenarrative@gmail.com, or you can reach out to Lauren on Instagram, me on LinkedIn. And
Mm-hmm.
we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah. And what is something that you would, say to somebody, whether they're listening or not, just like if they're really struggling with some of the things that we're talking about with the way that the mental health industry works, what are some things that you would recommend that they try? What are some things that you would recommend that they focus on?
Yeah, I think for me, like, to me, medication is a band-aid. I know it's hard for me to say, like, I can't say any of them have worked for me. I do know, I said it to my psychologist and she said that she has had people that it's helped. So I do believe that there is a place for it.
Mhm.
However, I don't think it replaces the deeper work. To me, it's a band-aid, and you need to do the deeper work, which is the therapy to get at it. And
Mhm.
for me, the therapist that's going to work for you, it's definitely about like, what are you trying to get through? And then also like, don't pick the first one, find one that resonates with you, right? Like I had that guy that told me I wasn't depressed. And then I have a psychologist now that I really feel is helping me. So
Yeah.
it's really about finding the person that understands you.
Mhm. I think that is so important too. And just saying, like, yes, there is a little bit of trial and error, but what you're looking for is not necessarily the person that says that we're going to fix this right away. You're looking for the person that you are able to form a connection with. And that feeling of connection and of community can be so helpful just in terms of getting you back on your feet and starting those really hard conversations that need to be had.
Yeah, and I think like I know you do this for a living, but I think even some of the conversations I've had with people about their mental health, like I think honestly, I feel like it helps them. Like I'm not an expert in any way about anything. Well, maybe about maintenance and reliability and maybe leadership too, but I'm not an expert in mental health. But even just the resonance that you feel for somebody, I think it really helps them. And that's like if you want to reach out to either one of us to talk, like we're happy to talk with you.
Yeah, yeah, and I can say that and just echo that too, right? The idea of being heard and hearing other people is so impactful, and I think it is because, as you know, human beings, we are all looking for community. We are all looking for a place that we fit in. And that goes back to, you know, the days when we were hunter gatherers and we needed community to survive. We are absolutely fooling ourselves if we don't believe that we still need that level of community, and that level of support and togetherness. So, if sharing your story is something that will get you to that community, by all means, do it. And I said in the last one, taking that first step is honestly the hardest, but the opportunity that it lays out after taking that step is huge and far more impactful in a positive way than I think it could be in a negative way.
Yeah, it's funny, right? Like the first time I shared my story, I had a panic attack and I ended up in a doctor's office with 5 days of benzos. And
Mhm.
it was like I thought, like telling my story, like basically my community would be like, well, this guy, like he's broken. There's something wrong with him. We don't want to do anything with him anymore. And
Yeah.
it was the opposite. Like what I got back was more connection than I thought was possible. And that was really, I think, what people can take away is like, yeah, it's hard. And maybe I don't recommend blasting it out there on a podcast on your first go like I did.
Uh-huh.
Um, but definitely like finding a safe space, a psychologically safe space where you can tell your story, whether that's, you know, to a loved one, to a family member, to a friend, something like that. Even if you want like to one of us, like
Mhm.
I think that it will help you. And like now, you know, like you see me, basically, we're not even a year later, and you can see how open I am with it right now.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story. And every single time I hear it, I get goosebumps. And there is no better fitting idea that goes into that story than the high performance narrative itself. Like I can't find a better way to summarize that up. But wow, thank you so much, Rob.
Oh, thank you, Lauren. Now we gotta give you some space. So, Lauren, where can people find you?
People can find me on Instagram at LaurenWillie17, or they can email me, Lauren at elitehighperformance.com. Reach out to me however you want, whatever you're most comfortable with, and I will be there.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if you want, well, if you haven't yet, follow Dismantling the High Performance Narrative on LinkedIn. Follow Lauren on Instagram. Her contact info is in the podcast notes. You can follow me on LinkedIn. My LinkedIn is in the podcast notes as well. Subscribe to Dismantling the High Performance Narrative on your favorite podcast platform. And definitely tell all your high performer friends to listen to the show as well. We would love that as well. And if you have any questions, any advertising, you want to book us as speakers, you want to book us as any of the services that we offer, you can send us an email, highperformancenarrative@gmail.com, and both of us will get it. We'll get back to you. If you're going to want to check out Lauren's services, you can go to elitehighperformance.com and book her there. If you want to check out my services, either in leadership or reliability consulting, you can go to robsreliability.com. And Lauren, I'm excited about this one. Like we're going live tomorrow. So
Yeah.
what do
Yeah.
you think?
Oh, we're ready for it. How do you feel after being in the hot seat?
I always feel good about the hot seat. I'm open. I'm an open book now. So I hope people really resonated with that one. And I know I really resonated with your story last week. So I really hope the people listening are just feeling that community from us.
Oh, I absolutely know that they are, because that stuff's powerful. There's no getting around that.
I love it. Now, everyone listening, we really appreciate you listening, and definitely come back next week. We're going to have another great show for you. So thank you, and we'll see you
Absolutely.
next week.
See ya.